știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Его утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весь летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 10th of March 2025, and here we are with the live stream looking at the war in Iran, as the war between the US and Iran as things currently stand, and what is the likelihood and method by which Iran would actually seek to win. What does victory actually look like? Now, here we must consider various different factors as to like how the war is being waged by each side and what victory looks like. Now, the other night, 2 days ago, we spent a considerable amount of time looking at the potential for a US victory and what that would mean and the barriers that are in the way of a US victory, and various methods by which the US imperialists would try to actually prevail in this, and why each way presented a unique set of problems. Now, what I'm going to do tonight is look at, well, what are the stated Iranian objectives, and how can these be obtained? So when it comes to the stated objectives of Iran, and these are the objectives that have been outlined by Iranian officials so far, including Aragchi, the foreign minister, and various different official government spokespeople. The objectives that they have talked about relate to ending the US, well, the very long US siege on Iran, which has gone on for a very long time now, and ending the security threats to Iran posed by principally the US and Israel. Now, that necessitates a withdrawal of American offensive capabilities from around Iran. And of course, the capitulation of the Israelis, though if the Americans capitulate, the Israelis aren't going to make war on Iran on their own. Now, the other elements of a potential Iranian victory relates to the removal of the economic siege on Iran. So it would seem that what we are looking at now is an Iranian attempt to remove the state of siege that has surrounded them, both economic and military, for well over a decade, and essentially reversing 47 years of US policy. And not only that, now ending the US presence in the West Asian region. And to that end, this is how Iran is actually building its strategy. It's how the senior members of the government are actually articulating things. Now, what's happened over the last few days is that the oil price spiked thanks to the difficulty of transitioning oil from the Strait of Hormuz out onto the open sea. Now, the Iranians have stressed that the Strait of Hormuz isn't blocked, but it's just that they are controlling access to it, and that most ships don't dare to actually leave, especially those that are associated with the United States, Britain, or any of the other allies of the US imperialists. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has declared that anybody who wants to transit a ship through the Strait of Hormuz can do so, as long as those in the home country are prepared to close down the Israeli and US embassies. So this is what they've said to the Gulf tyrannies. Now, the Gulf tyrannies, of course, are referred to Qatar, UAE, which is, quite frankly, the UAE is one of the most evil regimes on earth. I mean, it is, of course, it's a servant principally of US and British imperialism, but as well as one of the servants of this system, it is a particularly foul one. It is the UAE who has been behind much of the slaughter in Yemen over the last decade. It is the UAE that has been, I would argue, acting as the agent of imperialism in Sudan and carrying out, and its forces, or the forces sponsored by the UAE in Sudan, have carried out many, many horrible massacres there. So the UAE is one of the most repulsive and evil regimes on earth. And quite frankly, you don't have to do an awful lot of research to realize that. A very brief search on name your search engine of choice would bring up all the things that the UAE is associated with. Even bourgeois organizations note just how rotten the UAE rulers are. But of course, this is, they are dedicated servants of imperialism, and this is what imperialism seeks to defend. Now, the demands by the Iranians that the Saudis, the UAE, Qataris, Kuwaitis stop allowing their territory to be used by the imperialists, and more to the point, break off relations with Israel. These are all demands which the Iranian leadership knows full well none of these countries can accede to. even if the individual rulers wanted to, their very existence of the royal families, the royal parasites that run these tyrannies, like in Kuwait, in Saudi, UAE, Qatar, these are all products of imperialism. They are the creations of imperialism. They are largely the creation of British imperialism, but with American imperialism being in there as well. And their entire position is dependent upon being a provider of raw resources to the imperialist bloc, but also as being a place to rinse capital through, a provider of certain services to the imperialists, and their economies are bound up with the imperialist masters. So asking them to break relations with the United States is like asking them to sever an artery. They can't do it. Now, the Iranians aren't stupid. They know they can't do it. But what it is it's a presentation of this to the world in reasonable terms, which is that, well, if the Americans withdraw from these countries, then these countries won't be attacked. Or even if one took the idiotic pronunciations of Pezeshkian, even his announcement that, well, if the Americans don't launch attacks from your country, we will attack you. Well, even that's impossible for them to do. These countries have no independent existence. The only real potential power they ever had or have is the power to pull their money out from the United States, which we talked about on the last stream. Now, they won't be able to do that either, because if they try and pull their money from the United States will give them a one-finger answer, which is that, basically, because that money doesn't exist. Essentially, all of the wealth funds that the Saudis and the others put their wealth into, these are Ponzi schemes, gigantic Ponzi schemes. And if you try and pull your money out, you'll find that it just isn't there, or the US will just not let you. So these countries have no independent existence. Nothing that the leaders of these countries say should be taken remotely seriously, especially when it comes to their frantic denials that they were ever involved with the attack on Iran, or that they were in any way lobbying for an attack on Iran. Of course they were. Of course they were. Like Mohammed bin Salman might have signed a peace deal with Iran under Chinese sponsorship, but fundamentally the entire structure of the Saudi state is filled with people who are US assets, who are vehemently hostile to Iran. Of course they were lobbying for an attack on Iran. Even if bin Salman himself wasn't doing it, we don't know whether he was or not, those around him would have been. And so this is the Iranians providing the masses in the West with, I would say, a good course on political education, which is that the fuel crisis in the West now that's developing rapidly could be resolved by simply breaking relations with at least Israel. And that would be something that would be very popular even in Britain. So of course, the British will never do that. And so it'll be an important moment of education for the population when the fuel prices go through the roof and everyone is asking, why on earth have the prices gone up so high? And the answer can be given, because the British would not break relations with the genocidal state of Israel or the United States. In fact, breaking relations with the United States would also be a very popular measure to take, but that's incredibly unlikely. But to go back to the point, the objectives of the Iranians, as they become clear, is to neutralize all of the security. They're using this war to neutralize or push for neutralization of all the security threats that present themselves to them, and that means essentially getting the US pushed out of the Gulf regimes and in putting the US in a position where it can no longer easily project power against Iran, and where Israel no longer poses a threat. Now, how likely are these to be achieved? Well, the Iranians appear to have studied the fragile nature of the US imperialist system. And that is why they have concentrated, they are slowly escalating their attacks against the Gulf tyrannies, against US bases and US forces, and against, of course, Israel. They are also have also seemed to have carefully handled the potential dangerous escalation routes the US had available to it. The early intervention against the Kurdish forces, which seems to have actually delivered at least a significant number of US prisoners to Iran, as far as we can tell so far. The Azerbaijani regime so far has chosen not to commit suicide by attacking Iran on behalf of the US imperialists. The Turks were fired upon by somebody, but the Iranians are denying it was them. In fact, Erdogan is now talking about setting up a joint operations room between Iran and Turkey in order that they can assess who's firing what, because there are forces at work, mainly being the US and Israel, who are looking for an army to send against Iran. And it can't be, no matter what Trump says or tweets about, or truths about, it can't be the US army. No matter what stunt the Pentagon is pulling. So, for instance, they're talking about, well, we're going to deploy the 82nd Airborne. Okay, and what are you going to do with it? Where are they going to go? They're talking about occupying an island called Karg Island, Kharg, which is in the Persian Gulf, contains a lot of strategic energy assets of Iran. They're talking about occupying that. Well, what are they going to do when they stick their forces in there? I mean, they'll be sitting ducks for Iranian attempts to remove them. It's like part of the reason why the Russians didn't hold on to Snake Island, just off the coast of Ukraine, because you stick forces there, they end up being sitting ducks for your opponent, on an island where your opponent has the escalation advantage. So where is the 82nd Airborne going to go? Does anybody know? Is any plan clear here? You have this other move pulled off by the Americans at the moment, where they're putting all these big, fancy-looking bombers in airfields in Britain. So, okay, well, what are they going to do with those? Well, probably roughly the same thing they're doing with their other aircraft at the moment, which is sitting a long way off Iranian airspace, firing what are called standoff munitions, and then turning around and going home again. So the deployment of these huge bombers, which are slower and rather unwieldy, in a lot of cases, certainly in the case of the B-52, which is an ancient plane, well, what is that supposed to do? Iran is now showing that it has the technology to intercept Tomahawk missiles, one of which has been recovered intact. So if they can intercept Tomahawk missiles, I'm pretty sure the air defense is sophisticated enough to target like slow-moving bombers, which are outdated technology anyway, largely. So all of what the US is doing, how the US is fighting this war, is coming up with, just as the British do in the Ukraine war, a series of gimmicks, which doesn't actually save them from having to address Iran's victory conditions, or Iran's escalatory ladder, shall we say, which is that they have moved slowly, actually with great rapidity, but it feels like the war's been going on a lot longer than it actually has. Inside 10 days, they've moved to eliminate all of the sophisticated radar systems that the US has available to it. They've eliminated the Israeli satellite control system after the coordinates were posted online by 2 random Twitter accounts. They've effectively blinded the US in the region. They have forced the Israeli air defense system into complete failure. So now it would seem that the Iranians can rain down missiles on Tel Aviv and elsewhere with almost no restrictions. And indeed, the Tel Aviv is incurring a significant battering, to the point where Israeli officials are now leaking to the Washington Post saying, well, this isn't the war we gambled upon. What the hell can we do? The answer is not very much at the moment. So what you have here is the Iranians, despite the fact that they are taking casualties, there is reportedly over 1,000 dead in Iran already. There is significant poisoning of the air via the Israeli-US bombing of oil refineries. But the Iranians are doing more damage overall to the US than is being done to them. Now, here, of course, when studying war in this day and age, one can only do it truly and accurately via, of course, referencing the work of people like Clausewitz, but also studying war in a Marxist-Leninist fashion. Now, what we do here is, of course, try and bring you the way in which not only the facts themselves, but the way in which to analyze them. Now, the purpose of Marxist-Leninist analysis in the study of war extends far beyond cataloging battles, casualties, and territorial changes. This occupies conventional military historiography. Our approach begins from the recognition that war is, as Clausewitz observed, the continuation of politics by other means, and politics in class societies is the concentrated expression of economic relations and class relations. This means that every military campaign, every bombing run, every diplomatic maneuver must be traced back to the material interests of real and definitive social classes, the structural requirements of particular modes of production, and the contradictions inherent in this specific stage of capitalist development, the imperialist stage, the highest stage of capitalist development. Now, the war between the US imperialists and Iran is not an aberration. It's not a mistake, as some will insist. It's not the result of a misunderstanding or a miscalculation by Trump. However incompetent, buffoonish, and however much of a bloated bag of rotting offal Trump might be, it is this war being the necessary product of imperialism as the highest and most rotten stage of capitalism. It is the inevitable expression of the contradictions identified by Lenin over a century ago that have only deepened and got more severe in the previous 100+ years. Now, what distinguishes the Marxist-Leninist analytical framework is the capacity to move beneath the surface phenomena of rhetoric from politicians, bourgeois media narratives, minute-to-minute military analysis, to grasp the underlying laws of motion that generate all of these phenomena. When Trump declares that he will select Iran's future leadership, we do not simply condemn this as arrogant or illegal, though it is certainly both, but we recognize it as the unvarnished statement of imperialist intent that the imperialist politicians usually conceal behind humanitarian, liberal, and justifications, including the idea that they're bringing democracy to a particular country. Trump, of course, being an expression of the crisis of US imperialism, and really, due to the crisis, Trump has become the concentrated essence of US imperialism, which is, of course, why the bourgeois don't like him. When the bourgeois press speak of democracy promotion or the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, we, as Marxist-Leninists, understand these as ideological expressions that mystify the real objectives of imperialism, such as market penetration, resource extraction, hyper-exploitation of labor, and strategic control of resources and land. Our analysis is simultaneously explanatory and critical. It explains why events unfold as they do, and it situates these events within a totality that reveals their transformative potential and their ultimate transcendence through revolutionary struggle. The contemporary relevance of the study of war via the method of Marxism-Leninism has been demonstrated with particular force in this particular conflict. The failure of the Trump's shock and awe style strategy, the failure of aerial bombardments and targeted assassinations to achieve regime change, the failure of the economic shocks to destroy Iran, and then the consequent shocks transmitted through the global energy markets into an already crisis-riddled Western economic model. And this shows that these individual phenomena need to be understood as part of the generalized crisis of imperialism. And therefore, to understand the way that the imperialist countries wage their wars, one has to understand what the purpose of imperialism is and what the ruling classes of the imperialist bloc require. Now, without the framework of Marxism-Leninism, we are left with disconnected observations. For instance, we would not understand really and truly why the regime, as it is referred to by the US, why the Islamic Republic has prevailed. Why is it that the Iranian masses not only do not come out into the street against the Islamic Republic, but have rallied to the defense of their nation? Why is the resilience of Iran so strong? The liberal analysis and the moment-by-moment takes of multipolarist theorists don't give you the reality of why this is happening. Empirical descriptions fail usually to cohere into a systematic understanding, and political responses that address symptoms rather than causes. Within this framework, the framework of Marxism-Leninism, we can anticipate tendencies, identify opportunities for revolutionary action, and orient our practical activity towards the transformation of the very conditions that produce imperialist war into conditions that favor the bringing down of the imperialist system. Now, we must, of course, distinguish between surface narratives and the structural realities. This constitutes one of the most fundamental operations of Marxist-Leninist analysis, and its application to the present conflict is particularly illuminating. The surface narrative offered by the Trump administration and their media defenders would present the war as a response to the nuclear ambitions of Iran, and that this was a preventative strike against an existential threat to regional and global security, and as an opportunity to liberate the Iranian people from theocratic oppression. Now, if you look at the pictures of Donald Trump recently in the White House being prayed over by evangelicals, you will ask a rather interesting question of yourself, if you are a thinking person, of, well, who is the theocracy here? Now, each element in the imperialist narrative dissolves upon contact with historical and analytical scrutiny, revealing beneath it the structural realities of the desperate need of the imperialists for expansion and the crisis that actually motivates and shapes their approach to this war. Now, if we consider the claim regarding Iranian nuclear weapons made over and over and over again by the Trump administration, the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, a tool of the UN and thus ultimately a tool used by imperialism, even they have consistently verified Iran's compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was put in place in the period of the Obama administration, until Trump, of course, arbitrarily withdrew from it in 2018. And the IAEA confirmed that the Iranians were sticking to that deal, and that even subsequent Iranian enrichment activities remained far below the threshold necessary for nuclear weapons production, until, of course, more recent times when the IAEA were removed. Now, more fundamentally, the possession of nuclear weapons by other regional powers, Israel, but also Pakistan, has never triggered comparable American military responses, revealing that the American imperialists are rather selective in their application of the rhetoric of non-proliferation. Now, they were generally had to accept Pakistan having nuclear weapons because at that stage, Pakistani military was still something that was very much under the control of the United States. Israel, of course, having a nuclear weapon is essentially a forward operating base for American nuclear weapons. The structural reality is that nuclear capability, actual or potential, functions as a deterrent against imperialist intervention to some degree, and the elimination of a potential nuclear program would only render Iran more vulnerable to following the fate of Iraq, Libya, and other countries that lacked such a deterrent. But I will emphasize again, as I have spoken of repeatedly, that it is not merely having a nuclear weapon which stops the American imperialists repeatedly fucking with you. They have repeatedly fucked with Pakistan, who are a nuclear power, because they have effectively subordinated large elements in the Pakistani state structure to their own whims. Now, the American objective, of course, as always with the imperialists, is not what they say. It is not about the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, but about the removal of any obstacle towards the reabsorption of Iran into the US-led imperialist system. Now, of course, there are other narratives, such as the liberation of the Iranian people, fall apart on closer examination. The US imperialists, of course, support the Saudi monarchy, the Gulf tyrannies, the Egyptian military regime, all completely squalid, very oppressive systems, which do murder and enslave their people more than Iran has ever done. Now, the methodological importance of distinguishing surface from structure extends to our analysis of military operations themselves. The bombing of schools, hospitals, and bridges by the imperialists is presented as unfortunate collateral damage, or in slightly more hyper unreal versions and propaganda put out there by the Israelis, the consequence of Iran bombing its own people, as the failed comedian Omid Jalili said the other day. The actual reality, documented by the historical record of the wars waged by the US imperialists from Korea to Yugoslavia to Iraq, is that the terrorization of civilian populations constitutes a deliberate strategy to break national will and facilitate subsequent political collapse. The targeting of economic infrastructure, such as the Tehran refinery and the international airport, reveals the priorities assigned by imperialism to destroying the material basis of Iranian sovereignty, rather than to merely focus on military objectives. This is, of course, war being the extension of politics by other means. You can tell what the actual objectives are of imperialism by what they bomb, because they bomb not just military objectives. They bomb industrial targets, they bomb infrastructure targets, they bomb civilian targets, anything which could serve to hold the Iranian nation together, anything which could serve to strengthen the position of the Iranian masses, any utility that is, will be destroyed, because it gives away here what the actual objection of US imperialism is, the actual objectives of US imperialism are, I should say, which is to destroy any notion of any means by which Iran can retain its sovereignty and independence, including its industrial base, its educational base, its technological base, and they will do so whilst killing as many Iranians as humanly possible. Now, we move to the necessity of a historical materialist analysis. Historical materialism provides the indispensable foundation for any adequate comprehension of any war, and its application to the present war demonstrates both its explanatory power and its contemporary relevance. Now, the basic premise of historical materialism, that social being determines social consciousness, that the mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. Remember, as Marx said, that the ruling ideas of any epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. And this directs our attention to the transformations in capitalist production and accumulation that have generated the present conjuncture. The war between the US and Iran cannot be understood as an isolated event, a product of particular decisions by particular leaders, but must be situated within the long-term development of the imperialist system and its crisis that has been intensifying every year since 2008. The historical materialist approach requires us to examine the actual development of American-Iranian relations over the post-war period, tracing the transformation from the subordination of the Shah's regime to the revolutionary breakthrough of 1979 and the subsequent decades worth of US efforts to reverse this breakthrough via direct warfare, economic warfare, unleashing of proxies, and now the most direct war they've ever engaged in against Iran. This history reveals the persistence of imperialist objectives despite multiple changes in administrations. To the timing, the specific timing of this war in 2026 requires examination of the immediate economic and political conjuncture, the accumulation of contradictions in the global economy, the intensification of the aggression of the US imperialists in what they would say is defense of their interests, or expansion of their interests, I should say, the domestic political troubles of the Trump administration, and the perceived window of opportunity that they were trying to exploit. Now, historical materialism directs our attention to the differentiated impact of the war upon various social classes and national formation. Now, the interests served by this war are those, of course, of finance capitalism. These interests that are neither identical with nor compatible at all with those of American workers. Now, the Iranian response to imperialist aggression, whilst organized through state institutions such as the IRGC and the conventional military, reflect a national resilience and resistance that has a tremendous significance for anti-imperialist struggles worldwide. And this is regardless of the exact political character of the Iranian system. The Iranian system has always been a hybrid model, something which is uniquely Iranian, clearly, and which has always been something which has sided with national liberation movements. This is another reason why the US wishes to destroy it. These distinctions, which historical materialism enables to draw with precision, are essential for orienting our practical political activity. The methodological priority of production relations over ideological formations has particular relevance for understanding the economic dimensions of the present conflict. The energy shocks, financial market disruptions, and supply chain crises triggered by the war are not secondary or incidental features, but constitutive elements of imperialist warfare in an integrated, imperialist, globalized economic system. Historical materialism enables us to trace the connections between military operations and their economic effects, to understand how the destruction of productive forces and the disruption of circulation networks serve particular class interests, while undermining the general conditions of capitalist accumulation, and to identify the contradictions that these destructive dynamics generate within the imperialist camp itself. Without this methodological orientation, we'd be left with merely empirical descriptions of economic turbulence, unable to grasp their systematic character and their political implications. So, the theoretical foundation that we use for all of our analysis is, of course, Lenin's work on imperialism. Now, I've talked about this many times before. Of course, Lenin wrote this in the middle of the First World War, dealing with the consequences of the enormous betrayals of the Second International, and seeking, as he was, to reach a deeper understanding of imperialism, due to the fact that he needed to build or rebuild the theoretical weaponry and modes of analysis of the Russian Marxists after so many of their own number had collapsed into social chauvinism, including many of the Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, and indeed Lenin's old mentor, Plekhanov. Now, we've talked before about the five fundamental characteristics of imperialism as a distinct stage of capitalist development. I'll just run through them briefly here. First, the concentration of production and capital to such a degree it creates monopolies, which play the decisive role in economic life. Secondly, the merging of bank capital with industrial capital to create finance capital, and of course the consequent financial oligarchy, which is what the ruling class becomes. Thirdly, the export of capital is distinguished from the export of commodities, which thereby the export of capital acquires exceptional importance. Fourth, the formation of international monopolist capitalist associations, the multinational corporation, that share the world among themselves. And fifth, the territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers, the biggest imperialist powers, more accurately so. And this, of course, has changed somewhat. This fifth element has changed a little since 1945, which is that the imperialist powers all then organize themselves in one bloc, then led by the USA. And what we're seeing now is not a fight between different imperialist powers for a redivision of the world. It's a fight between the imperialist-led bloc, the US imperialist-led bloc, and various non-imperialist powers to reorganize the world accordingly. And whether it's going to be reorganized around the terms of the Chinese and the Russians, which are of course far more egalitarian, shall we say, than those offered by the US imperialists, or whether the US imperialists will reassert their control over things. Now, situation as we face it now, and here we'll turn to the Iranian victory conditions, are that the US absolutely has to, as we covered in the previous stream, the US has to destroy the independent existence of Iran. And again, this has nothing to do with the religious elements, the fact that Iran is described itself as an Islamic Republic. Well, that wouldn't be a problem if it was an Islamic Republic that played ball with US imperialism. If Iran was run by a supreme leader, a supreme religious figure, who had overseen various governments that sank Iran into debt to US imperialism, that privatized state assets, that allowed Iran to be asset stripped, that allowed Iran to be beggared with piles of debt owed to imperialist financial institutions, then the US imperialists would have absolutely no problem with that kind of supreme leader. The fact is, though, that the peculiar form of anti-imperialist resistance that grew up in Iran in the 60s and 70s that culminated in the Islamic Revolution of 1979 combines large elements of anti-imperialist resistance within it, and this is what has propelled Iran into becoming a truly a much more independent country, and one that can resist imperialism. This is why they rant and they rave about theocracies. They have no problem with theocracies, not really, because a theocracy can be very compatible with being integrated into the US-led imperialist system. Now, when we're talking about the contemporary relevance of historical materialism and, of course, Lenin's analysis of imperialism, the US-led imperialist bloc, of course, are all in on the war with Iran. Now, there's various different ways in which they're going in. You've seen multiple contradictions in policy with regard to the British imperialists. You've seen the French imperialists jumping in. Macron did this ludicrous thing where he jumped out of a helicopter and announced that the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier would be going to the Persian Gulf to join the defense of the heroic Gulf comprador nations. This, of course, is Macron again being the pathetic little jumped-up creep that he always is, and desperately seeking to make himself look important when he's really not. Iran declared that if the French decided to get interested in them, then they would receive interest in return. I really don't think that the Iranians are worried too much about the French fleet turning up there, to be honest. Now, if we go further into the decision-making made by the Trump administration, which is that the Trump administration and its wildly contradictory justifications require particular attention, given there are now distinctive characteristics of the second Trump administration that weren't there to the same degree in the first, and that these have implications for the way that the war is initiated and the way that the US imperialists have conducted the war. Now, the return of Trump to the presidency in January of last year feels like much, much longer ago. Following the electoral defeat of the Harris team, remember, old Joe was pensioned off just at the start of the campaign. Now, this created conditions for the implementation of foreign policy orientations that had been articulated somewhat under the previous Trump presidency, but had never really come to fruition, and also that were expressed by the Biden administration in the intervening period. Now, the composition of the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, featured a greater number of figures who were more committed to a full-blown war of aggression against Iran, and the marginalization or relative marginalization of political figures who are more cautious with regard to military action. Now, this also comes with, of course, the priorities of the Trump administration in its second term being more aggressive than its first term. Now, that's a necessity because the crisis of imperialism has only got worse in the last few years. The Biden administration started a war in Ukraine, which it couldn't possibly win. And so imperialism is desperate for a target, any target. Now, Trump's second administration is a lot more nakedly militaristic, even more so than his first. It is much more revels much more in death and destruction. Trump certainly does, even more so than his first term. And what it reflects is the multiple converging factors here. The administration's domestic political situation, including their approach to the midterm elections and the need to consolidate support amongst its withering base through dramatic foreign policy action. This appears to have motivated them over things like the Venezuela issue, and it appears also to motivate them over this. Now, the economic context, characterized in the US by a persistent inflationary pressure and concerns regarding low rates of growth, this may also have added to the calculations that the destruction of the Iranian system and the subordination of Iran could be very beneficial for the US system, as that horrendous, obese hamster, Lindsey Graham said, everybody's going to get paid when the regime falls. Now, the international context also includes things we need to pay attention to here. The Trump administration remains, just as the Biden administration was, committed to ultimately to some kind of conflict with the Chinese. Though given how badly this war is going for them so far, China seems like a very distant prospect in terms of the US being able to challenge them. But ultimately, it is something the US will seek to go back to. The other point to make here is that the Bonapartist tendencies within the American presidency have been getting worse and worse year on year. And this, again, is a tendency that goes back many decades. The decision-making process itself, with regard to how the Trump administration acts, has only furthered the process of concentrating all power in a very small circle around the president. This was true also of the Biden administration. Basically, most decisions over war and peace were not made by Biden himself or Harris. They were made largely by Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan in the case of the Biden administration. Now, similar process is in play here with Trump. This concentration of decision-making power, characteristic of what we've called before Bonapartist tendencies within the imperialist system, has implications both for the initiation and conduct of military operations. On the one hand, it enables the kind of rapid, unencumbered decision-making that the ruling class looks for. On the other hand, it increases the US to vulnerability via the prospect of miscalculation, the difficulty of policy adjustment once a decision has been rapidly made, and the potential for contradiction between political pronunciations and military realities. Now, all of this produces the real mess that is the US war strategy, where it seems to have a policy every 5 minutes, because basically Trump is trying to play to multiple different audiences and keep multiple different plates in the air. Now, when confronted with the potential disaster of a spiking oil price, Trump then panics and makes commitments over making further releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and starts making noises about bringing the war to an end. Or that the war's objectives have already been met, which, as we covered the other night, just simply isn't true. The fact is, though, that given how badly things are apparently going, there are various ruling class voices who are calling via the politicians they control on Capitol Hill for an end to the war. Now, will the US imperialists go for an end to the war? Not under current conditions, because the only way that they are prepared to accept an end to the war won't be on the Iranian conditions, because much like with Ukraine, and I saw we had a question about Ukraine earlier, much like with Ukraine, the US imperialists won't want to lose their capacity to return to this war at a later date. Now, so even if they were to agree to some kind of peace deal, they would not like, in fact, they will be desperate not to, lose their ability to project power and to rain death down upon Iran. So the prospect of them agreeing at this stage to withdraw all of their bases and their men from the West Asian region. In the immediate period, that prospect isn't exactly high. However, if the war goes on and on and on, and the US runs out of ammunition, loses more and more forces, and more instability creeps into the Gulf tyrannies, then you'll see some serious movement from the US imperialists, because they can't afford to sustain those kind of losses. Now, the other thing to emphasize here is that the US imperialists, of course, are desperate to not admit to their own casualties. They're desperate to not admit to all the things that have gone wrong, though that will, of course, come out in the fullness of time. So the whole war, the reason why Trump's now being accused of like massive incompetence, is that the whole war was built around a completely flawed and foolish assumption that by killing Khamenei, that would lead to an Iranian collapse. Completely untrue, as it turns out. And what it reveals is just how phenomenally crass and stupid the American planners are. I mean, Pete Hegseth being first amongst those. Now, the other elements here that need to be paid attention to is that the persistence of shock and awe thinking inside the US military political structures isn't just about being wedded to old ideas. It's a reflection of material reality, which is the US can't afford to fight long wars. They just can't. They need them over, and they need them over quick. So that's why they made no planning for a long war. They were absolutely convinced they could convince themselves that the Iranians would collapse. And when they didn't, nobody knew what to do. They still don't really know what to do, to be completely honest with you. So now again, the specific characteristics of Operation Epstein's Fury, as many are calling it, or Operation Epic Fury, is that there are many different objectives that the US has, which has been stated in contradictory manner by Trump himself. It's either regime change, elimination of one bit of the Iranian armed forces or another, etc., etc. But fundamentally, what this is about is trying to collapse the Iranian government itself. That's what's really going on here, no matter what else they say, no matter how many crocodile tears they shed about protesters, women, or anything else. Again, like the bombing of oil refineries, the bombing of schools, etc. This is all very, very deliberate. And this is the way that the imperialists wage war, not just the Israelis. This is how the US wages war. It's how the British do it. It's how the French and the Germans do it as well. And again, though, even with all of the brutality that imperialism can inflict, their actual ability to project power has been severely curtailed. And certainly Israel has suffered an awful lot of damage, leading to potential further instability there. The Israelis and the US respond by bombing more civilian areas in the hope of terrorizing the population out of supporting the war. If anything, they'll be having the exact opposite effect. Now, to move towards some conclusions here, the Iranian victory, the Iranian victory conditions, so to speak, are now fairly well established. They require the lifting of the siege on their country, the end of the US garrisoning bases in West Asia, the end of the ability of the US to threaten them. If that can be given to Iran, then the war will end. But I doubt it. Trump has been rabbiting on about how he's got the war almost over, everybody. Well, all statistics suggest to the contrary. The US has been unable to deal decisive blows to Iran. Again, let's emphasize the point. They can kill a lot of people, but they're unable to break the Iranian resistance. And even if they put all these bombers in the air, and even if they launch more missiles, And if they drop more dumb bombs on Iran, again, this is absolutely no guarantee of anything other than more people dying, which is, of course, is part of the plan, but it's not the whole plan. Trump would love it if the Iranians were to capitulate, but it's just simply not a matter that is on the cards at this stage. It's not something that's coming up. Now, I saw an interesting question earlier, or I saw a comment that I did want to pick up on about the Ukraine war. This is from Walter Stoltzing, who asks, has anyone heard John Helmer on Nima today? He claims Putin endorsed the Witkoff-Kushner plan, that Dmitriev prevailed, etc. I would say two things, and here I want to link the Ukraine war and the Iran war. Both will continue. Even if the US, and this is one of the things that Trump's been thinking about doing, which is to declare a great victory and leave, the Iranians will probably not accept that. Why? Because that doesn't address their fundamental security problem. The fundamental problem is the presence of an aggressive US imperialist forces in the region, and the US imperialists' ability to wager crippling sanctions upon Iran. This is all what Iran's problem actually is. Now, the US imperialists will not want to address any of those issues. So the best I think the US will do is declare that they've won and try and leave, and I don't think the Iranians will let them slide that easily. Quite what they will do is another question, but this is not going to, they're not going to find an easy way out. Now, Helmer's comment on the Witkoff-Kushner plan. Well, quite frankly, I'll believe it when I see it. Now, Helmer's obviously got a lot of experience in Russia. He's got a lot of connections there. He seems to get his briefings from disgruntled elements within the military hierarchy. Now, as to whether Putin has decided to endorse the Witkoff-Kushner plan, again, only time will tell. But I would say this, that if he's endorsed that, then that would be, of course, a sign that the comprador types have triumphed in the internal debate in the Russian government. But it just doesn't seem like, to me, that that's the case. The Trump administration can't stop and won't stop fucking with Russia, nor will they want to abandon their Ukrainian proxy to be absorbed into the Russian Federation. They'll want to create as much chaos and disaster for the Russians as possible, which is what I think will actually happen. No matter what Dmitriev might want, no matter what Putin himself might want, there are many in the West, including, of course, in bold perfidious Albion, who want that war to continue no matter what. And I think that they will get their way. It'll ultimately be something that they will come to regret, but they will get their way. So this is the problem with a lot of this multipolar analysts, which is they don't put the connections together. They take things at face value. They think, well, the Americans look really confident and say they have got a deal lined up with the Russians. They're going to be signed any minute now, and then it just doesn't happen. And you learn that the Russians had certain objectives to it, and the US couldn't address those and just left. So the capacity of imperialism is declining all the time. But I guess we shouldn't be surprised. Now, moving to our final point here about Iranian victory. If the Iranians manage to pull off any of their conditions, such as if they manage to force the US out of the Persian Gulf region, this will be the biggest single revolutionary act by a state in many, many decades. It might inspire other revolutions in the near future, of course. But fundamentally, the US has very few means to force its way back into the Gulf. The spell is broken. The US has turned tail and run from various different places. And now Iran is very much in the driver's seat. I am sure the US will kill many more people before the end. I'm sure that they will create more orphans, more widows, more widowers, and create more horror stories than you can reasonably tell in one lifetime. But that is the imperialist way of war. Now, not commenting thus far on speculations as to regard to who's dead in Israel and who isn't. There's so many contradictory stories there that I'll only comment on them when we're absolutely certain. So, we have more coming up for you this week. We have 2 more episodes of Decline and Fall, one to be recorded tomorrow, one to be recorded on Friday. So keep an eye out for that. We have our promised India special, India and the Contradictions of Multipolarity. That is coming up at this time, 7 p.m. on Thursday of this coming week. So do keep an eye out for that. Yes, we will be doing emergency broadcasts as and when required. But until we come back to you tomorrow with the Decline and Fall show, thank you everybody for tuning in to Liberation News Network tonight. Hope you've gained something from this program. And thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon, on Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again very soon. But until then, enjoy the rest of your day. And here is your stirring outro.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И вам